Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Stefan Goldsand. I'm the president of the Psychoanalytic Society of the William Alanson White Institute and chair of the Colloquium Planning Committee. I'm also a graduate from this institute and its psychoanalytic program. Um, Welcome everybody to tonight's presentation of the Society's annual Colloquium Series with Dr. Scarfone, Dominique Scarfone, moderated by Dr. Orshi Onyadi. I would like to thank the Institute, the Society, the Colloquium Planning Committee for all the support to get this series going, to make it possible. Um, and I'd like to thank everybody as well. Here we have close to 200 people. More people will be joining shortly, and people from all across the country and different parts of the world. So welcome everybody. And we're very appreciative for the amazing response the series has received so far. And it's very encouraging to see this kind of like revitalized interest in psychoanalysis and its relevance to individuals and society at large. The theme of this year's series has been psychoanalytic synthesis and innovation in times of upheaval, and it follows on our institute's tradition of engaging with a variety of different perspectives and influences and fields of knowledge to expand our own understanding and practice of psychoanalysis. The series has included monthly presentations throughout the spring. We will continue. We have one more. Our next event will be on Friday, May 9th at 7:30. It will be in person with Dr. Gregory Rizzolo, moderated by Dr. Michael Rothman. So we hope that as many of you are able to join us for this last and closing event of the series. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I have a few important announcements to make. The presentation will go for about an hour, and then we'll have approximately 30 minutes for Q&A. Do write your questions on the Q&A function. It will be on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you hover to the right side, you will see a Q&A button. So when you press it, you can type in your questions and let us know what you're inquiring about, and we'll share the question with Dr. Scarfone. The other announcement to make is that this presentation is being recorded for archival purposes. So thank you for your patience. It is my absolute honor to introduce Dr. Dominique Scarfone. Dr. Scarfone is a 2024 Sigourney Award recipient, an honorary professor at the University of Montreal, member emeritus of the Montreal Psychoanalytic Society, that is a French branch of the Canadian Psychoanalytic Society, and an honorary member of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society. Dr. Scarfone was an associate editor of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis for several years and has recently retired from practicing, but he continues teaching, writing, and presenting. And he has published extensively, authoring various books and contributing numerous chapters of books, as well as original papers in journals internationally. His most recent book is The Reality of the Message, Psychoanalysis in the Wake of Jean Laplanche, that was published in 2023. We're also very fortunate to have with us tonight Dr. Orshi Onyadi, who is going to be our event moderator. Dr. Onyadi is a training and psychoanalyst and faculty of our institute, the William Alanson White Institute, and is the associate editor of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. This is a journal of our institute. She also studies and writes about topics that highlight the link between psychoanalysis and social societal phenomena. She has a full-time practice in New York City and will be also taking your questions. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Scarfone, Dr. Onyadi. Thank you very much. Share the spotlight with Dr. Scarfone, or if you can do. I mute my.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you, the William Alanson White Society and Institute, and Stefan Goldzahn in particular, for having invited me to this event. I am very honored and very pleased to be working with you tonight. Thank you also to Orshi Hunyadi, who will chair this session. I think that for the sake of saving time, I will just step into my paper, which I called A Passion Forevermore, for reasons that I hope will be clear as we go. I'll start with Freud, who almost a century ago published a book which was to become one of his best-selling books, Civilization and Its Discontents, in which he examined, among other things, the difficult demands placed on the individual by the fact of belonging to civilization. And he found that a major source of problems lies in the destructive tendencies derived from the death drive, a concept that he had introduced 10 years before. Civilization Discontents was in 1929-30, and 10 years before, he had introduced the death drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, as you may all know. And at the end of his book on civilization, he wrote the following: "The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human drive of aggression and self-destruction." Later on, he added, "Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help, they would have no difficulty in exterminating one another to the last man." And finally, he adds, "And now it is to be expected that the other of the two heavenly powers, eternal Eros, will make an effort to assert himself in the struggle with his equally immortal adversary. But who can foresee with what success and with what result?" End of quote. Freud certainly could not have imagined that the eternal Eros would not be able to prevent the horrors of the Second World War that would break 9 years later, a few days actually before or after his own death. Among these horrors, the Nazi extermination of the Jewish people, including members of Freud's own family. Had he lived until the end of that war, he would also, no doubt, have been appalled by the use of nuclear weapons. These all seems to confirm his apprehensions that I just quoted. But he might also have seen the post-war boom in births and the accelerated economical development as signs that the outcome of the battle between Eros and the destructive drives was not yet over, and that the outcome was not yet known. Now, the question is, for us today, what use can we make of the tools that Freud bequeathed us for thinking about our contemporary crisis? So let me take a look to the human drive of aggression. In the passage I quoted, Freud does not mention the death drive itself, but rather speaks of the human drive for aggression and self-annihilation. Is this just a terminological variant, or is the dead drive like the principle of inertia in physics, which, while not really the equivalent, shares with the dead drive at least one aspect, which is that it is theoretically necessary, but never observable as such, since something always impacts its manifestation in the real world. So similarly, in everyday life, we cannot see the dead drive, but we can surely observe on any day, unfortunately, the manifest effects of the drives of aggression and destruction. These facts also suggest that the all too human aggression and destruction are never separate from the sexual dimension in its sadomasochistic and cruel manifestations. There is indeed no war without rape and sexual assault, and rape itself is in fact used as a weapon of war, a tool for genocide and ethnic cleansing, as we saw in the Balkans, for instance, and elsewhere. Conversely, all rape implies exerting power over another. Physical rape or psychical rape, taking control of body and mind, soul murder, or are all visible under totalitarian or political religious fundamentalist regimes, where the sexual question looms large, whether as violent homophobia or as the total control of women's bodies, of their bodies, but also of their minds through indoctrination, for instance. All of this seems to support Laplanche's view that what Freud called the dead drive is in fact a sexual dead drive, and I will try to build upon that. Empirical facts do not in themselves dictate a theory, of course, but it is tempting to think that if in his conclusion Freud invokes not the death drive, but the drive for aggression and self-destruction, it is because he sticks to a formulation as close as possible to observable facts. For example, the control over the forces of nature that gives humans the capacity, as he said, of exterminating one another to the last man. Now, I'm interested in his use of the words like control and mastering, which direct our gaze towards a drive which is not mentioned in Civilization and its Discontents, but which was introduced long before that in the 3 essays on sexual theory in 1905. And this concept was never really expounded thereafter. I am referring to the concept that in German is called Bemächtigungstrieb, and I don't use the German word for pedantic reasons. I think it's important to refer to that single word because it will have many translations. Now, translation is always very instructive. Strachey in the Standard Edition translated Bemächtigungstrieb as instinct for mastery, which is a very legitimate translation. As for the French translators, they have opted for pulsion d'emprise, which is drive for control or possession, and sometimes also for pulsion de pouvoir, which is drive for power. Now, so we have 3 different possible different translations. For my part, rather than choosing between these 3 possibilities, I propose to see in them 3 moments of a continuum, going from mastery, which includes know-how, competence, to taking hold of, which suggests control, of course, but not necessarily a destructive one, and then onto to power with its inherent violence. In introducing Bemächtigungstrieb, Freud illustrates it in animals with the function of controlling the female body, for instance, by the male in view of mating. In humans, he refers to the grasping role of the hand in male masturbation. These are the examples he gives. Thus, the term is associated with sexual behavior, to be sure, which may include a certain amount of aggression, but in a controlled, mastered form. This supports the translation instinct for mastery, or the French pulsion d'emprise. In the same text, however, Freud also pointed to a violent version of Bemächtigungstrieb, manifest in the cruelty in children and the sadistic sexual drive. He also saw, interestingly, the drive for knowledge, Wisstrieb, as a sublimated form of Bemächtigungstrieb, thus putting it indeed on the side of mastery. It should be noted, however, that this drive does not operate in a vacuum, being subjected instead to the dynamics of the social system within which it unfolds alongside the other drives. To sum up, the word Macht in the term Bemächtigungstrieb, which means strength, power, might, can be taken to mean both mastery, including mastery over the drives themselves, why not? And the sadistic use of force to dominate other human beings, in which case we speak of power. Control, in the sense of taking hold, lies somewhere in between. What distinguishes one from the other remain to be seen, and I hope to make it clear as we go. Now, let me introduce two other terms: homeostasis and allostasis. If we consider the two extremes, we see that mastery and power are based on two contrasting dynamics. Mastery is homeostatic, while power is allostatic. The meaning of the latter term will become clearer as we go along, but let me stress right away that it was coined in the course of research into the biological mechanisms of addiction. To name what? A potentially destructive dynamic, about which I will say more later. As for us, in psychoanalysis, we posit that power is necessarily allostatic, insofar as staying in power requires ever more power, indeed, in the manner of an addiction. And I guess we don't need to look very far these days to see this dynamic at work. Homeostasis and allostasis also stand on opposite sides of a line that in humans separates self-preservation, which is homeostatic, from the sexual drives, allostatic. This is my proposal. Self-preservation drives like hunger and thirst are homeostatic in that they function according to a principle of constancy governing individual organisms. Constancy implies a feedback loop. A need arises, followed by a certain amount of psychic and somatic work, whose result restores equilibrium. Insofar as it aims at mastery, for instance, of the subject's own motor capacities and of his environment, Bemächtigungstrieb too is necessary for the individual's survival and therefore belongs to the class of self-preservation drives and could be seen as homeostatic. In animals, the sexual drive as well is homeostatic, regulated, as we know, by biological clocks. But in humans, on the contrary, sexual drives function according to an allostatic spiral of self-amplification, feed-forward, rather than feedback. In Laplanche's theory, for example, sexual drives were acquired during the infant's prolonged relationship of dependence through the sexual excitations unknowingly conveyed by the adult in his communication with the infant. These excitations, which exceed the infantile capacity to metabolize them, the infantile effort at translating these messages therefore succeeds only in part, failing in what regards their sexual component and leaving in its wake residues that form, in Laplanche's view, the primarily repressed. Now, the latter presses back on the infant's psyche for translation, which will fail again in part, and therefore there will be pressure again, and so on and so forth. Hence, the allostatic spiral, characteristic of the sexual drive. This means that repressed infantile sexuality will become disruptive insofar as it is associated, but this I will explain later, with a narcissistic aim for power over the object. Now, this is not really new, because Freud, without ever using the word allostatic, of course, actually gave a description of the sexual drive that is very corresponds very easily with allostatic dynamics. I'm quoting Freud from 1912. "It is my belief, however strange it may sound, that we must reckon with the possibility that something in the nature of the sexual drive is unfavorable to the realization of complete satisfaction." Now, this was 1912, long before Freud realized the major role played in psychic life by the compulsion to repeat, which is a ceaseless effort at mastery that would lead him to the hypothesis of a death drive. Now, interestingly, in the same text of 1912, he could already add, I quote, "Psychoanalysis has shown us that when the original object of a wishful impulse has been lost as a result of repression, it is frequently represented by an endless series of substitutive objects, none of which, however, brings full satisfaction." And here is the most interesting part. This is still Freud. "This may explain the inconstancy in object choice, the craving for stimulation," I highlight craving for stimulation, "which is so often a feature of the love of adults." Now, I note the craving for stimulation, in German, Reizhunger, the hunger for stimulation, that opposes complete satisfaction and sets up what we call today an allostatic dynamic or quest. It should also be noted that the spiral thus described is aimed at actually increasing arousal rather than discharging it to zero, which would be the aim of the death drive. So we have, at the same time that we have a kind of prequel to the death drive, we have also a certain difference that is inserted in Freud thinking at the time. And yet, this race to excitation can be just as unbinding and deadly as the race towards zero, that is the hallmark of the death drive. The case of addiction shows how the extremes sometimes converge. But fortunately, allostatic dynamics can also work in a productive way. So very quickly, for the sake of time, I will mention the work of Paul Valéry, this great intellectual author in French culture, who in his course on poetics at the end of his life, that is just close to the time of Freud's death, the end of the 1930s and beginning of the 40s. He gave a course at Collège de France on poetics, which was his way of addressing every kind of production of what he called l'esprit, the spirit or the mind. And here he says the following, I quote, "The order of practical things is defined by the fact that the response is finite. Once we have reached the object, once we have somehow responded to the stimulation in such a way as to cancel it out, the thing is over, the matter is settled, I drink, my thirst is satisfied, it's over." This was my translation from the French. So here he is obviously describing self-preservation and its homeostatic loop. But Valéry immediately brings up something else. Quote, that's not all. On the contrary, there are other perceptions, other effects of my sensibility, which are quite the opposite of these finite effects. Instead of leading to an act, which itself ends the thing and closes the circuit, it happens on the contrary that in these cases, satisfaction generates desire. And further on, he adds, this is the masterpiece of infinite sensibility, to create need from its satisfaction. Consequently, in opposition to or in contrast with the whole of these things which I have called practical, that is, effects with finite tendencies, it will be necessary to constitute what might be called the order of aesthetic things. So for him, aesthetic things belong to the series of phenomena that did not give way to something finite, but led towards the infinite and to situations where the response elicits desire even more. It is beyond the scope of my present work to compare point by point the respective conceptions of Freud and Valéry. It should be noted, however, that for Valéry, it is full satisfaction and not, as with Freud, incomplete satisfaction that generates the thirst for stimulus. However, we could argue that Valéry's infinite sensibility is by definition insatiable, and therefore that there is never a full satisfaction, which would bring Valéry and Freud much closer together. Now, Valéry, who defined himself as the least Freudian of men, he was proud of stating that he was the least Freudian of men, seems to be in fruitful dialogue with Freud, if you can see what I mean. When he speaks of aesthetic perceptions that excite the desire to rediscover them, we think we're reading what Freud formulated in relation to primary processes aimed precisely at reaching the identity of perception, of perceiving again the thing that was so satisfactory. These primary processes are generally understood to be involved in the aesthetic creation of and experience that Valéry deals with. But in the quotations I read of Valéry, I purposely skipped a passage in which he writes, I quote, "But when the result of the action is such that it re-engages desire, then thought, or the spirit, can and always do intervene, as do all the means, not only intellectual and spiritual, but all the physical means available to man to rediscover the pleasurable sensation." End of quote. So it is as if Valéry was describing the secondary processes as well, to which Freud assigned the search for identity of thinking. Even if Freud, in fact, stressed, and I quote, that all thinking is no more than a circuitous path from the memory of a satisfaction to an identical cathexis of the same memory, which it is hoped to attain once more through an intermediate stage of motor experiences. So the fact remains that despite his closeness to Freud's thinking, Valéry seems to be saying something different, that the drive themselves, or Freud's hunger for stimulus, are directly involved in the processes of thought and action in the relationship to reality, whereas one possible reading of Freud is that thought processes are situated at the opposite pole of the drives, though nourished by them. Here it looks as though Freud was facing a problem that Valéry had actually solved. Freud, indeed, because of his distinction between primary and secondary processes, or between the pleasure principle and reality principle, needed to invoke a problematic reality testing. This is a concept that is very problematic indeed in Freud. It is not clear how we do that. So Freud needed this problematic reality testing to ensure the transition from the dominance of the pleasure principle to that of the reality principle. Whereas in Valéry's case, doesn't seem to be any gap between the two domains, which in fact, and this is also interesting, I believe, Valéry's position resonates both with Winnicott's idea of the coexistence of reality and illusion, for instance, as well as with Laplanche's positing that primary processes actually do not come first chronologically, since, as Freud himself well knew, on the other hand, an organism endowed with primary processes alone would not survive 1 minute. As for us, having now seen that allostasis is not in itself necessarily destructive, we must ask what other factor is needed to give it a deleterious effect analogous to that of addiction. As we shall see, Valéry's own words will help distinguish between allostatic effects that could be said to be productive, such as the aesthetic experience, and the destructive allostatic effects revealed by the crises that beset us today. Let me now turn to the crisis in question. In an effort to understand the environmental, social, political, economic, and military crises of our time, we can search for their premises at the beginning of the modern era. It was during the European Renaissance, in fact, that the scientific revolution began to take shape, leading in turn to the rise of the technical and industrial revolutions, themselves inseparable companions of capitalism, which eventually conquered the planet. There is little risk in considering that alongside the real benefits of the techno-scientific development, the self-annihilating capacities achieved by humanity, as well as the human-made ravages inflicted on the planet, have everything to do with the conquering mentality of science and technology, boosted, no doubt, by the spirit of conquest of the great merchants and industrialists, later relayed by gigantic financial institutions. As for the revolutionary experiments that sought to break with capitalism while also claiming to achieve progress through scientific reason, well, we know that they've all failed miserably. Now, one of the leading figures in the scientific and technical revolution that began with the modern era was Sir Francis Bacon, whose famous maxim, I quote, "Nature to be commanded must be obeyed," end of quote, sounds like a paradoxical statement, but it is one that succinctly describes what was to come in the centuries that followed. To be able to obey nature, you first need to understand its laws, which is the project of modern science. Now, humans, of course, have always had ideas and opinions, some of them brilliant, about how nature works. What was new with Bacon and those who followed, Newton, Galileo, was to apply a rigorous method that went beyond intuition, however brilliant. This demanded that their scientific quest be itself subjected to a certain mastery and to critical control of its own procedures, thus increasing the power and efficiency of the experimental setups. So we have mastery, control, and power in science immediately. Here then is an exemplary manifestation of Bemächtigungstrieb, whose reflexive character places it as mastery at one end and the drive for power at the other end, and with taking hold located in between. The human quest for knowledge is often described as disinterested, pursuing no other goal than knowledge itself. In this sense, scientific research belongs, and this goes well with Valerie's categories, to the order of things of the spirit or the mind, therefore to a benign allostatic spiral by which the achievements of research fuel the desire to know more. But discovering the laws of nature was only the first step in Bacon's program, whose final goal he mentioned first, to command nature. This no longer concerns science alone, but also and above all, its technical derivatives. From the order of things of the spirit, we are then led back to the order of practical things. And according to Valerie, we should expect to see at work a homeostatic loop, except that on the way back from matters of spirit to practical matters, a new factor comes into play, the logic of capitalism, whose rule is clearly allostatic, grow or disappear. Let me be clear. Science and technology are precious achievements, and I'm not advocating they should be rejected. However, it must be admitted that their development within the framework of the capitalist principle of economy, grow or disappear, has placed scientific discoveries and technical inventions at the service of a desire to command the forces of nature, which has not been limited to mastery alone, intellectual or technical, nor operated in the disinterested spirit of knowledge and well-being. As soon as new knowledge and its associated techniques are acquired, they are caught up in the dynamics of capitalistic power relations. It follows that our relationship with nature, scientific or otherwise, is never direct, but is always mediated, informed, and I could say distorted by the divergent interests inside the capitalist organization of society. Bemächtigungstrieb, therefore, takes the form of appropriation and ultimately power, be it economic, political, military, or other, within a series of systems, individual, family, class, nation, caste, and so on, interlocked between them and articulated in complex and often, it must be stated, contradictory ways. Despite their insertion in such a complex nexus, individual dynamics, to which I turn now, need our attention. It could be said that one of the aims of the scientific method inaugurated by Bacon and refined by a long list of successors is to counter the effects of wishful thinking, the wishful thinking that can take hold of any researcher, leading them to read into the data obtained the results they hoped for at the outset. So interestingly, I am always happy to be able to say that to people who oppose science to psychoanalysis, that actually the psychoanalytic knowledge about fantasy and desire is what the scientific method is trying to counter, to control, and therefore gives substance to the idea of desire, unconscious desire, and fantasy, because the scientist must be kept safe from the self-fulfilling prophecies, that is, or the fantasy fulfilling reading of his results. The experimental method, with its mathematization and its crucial experiments, as well as its critical review by peers, can be seen as necessary precautions against the force of the experimenter's conscious or unconscious fantasies, which are in turn fed by dreams of glory, conquest, or enrichment. In short, the goal of the scientific method is to counter the hubris that easily takes hold of the human soul, aiming instead for a reflective mastery that would prevent the drift towards domination and power. Such a mastery of mastery constitutes a second-degree homeostasis loop, in no way, however, preventing the allostatic thirst for knowledge, but probably limiting its narcissistic strayings, about which I will say more later. Mastering mastery, then, is of course just as necessary in the technical domain as in the purely scientific field. The problem here is that the capitalistic logic of unlimited growth is so fond of the technical derivatives of science that precautions, controls, and limits are much less rigorously applied as in the scientific experiment. According to this logic, once a technique exists, there's no reason to limit its use. Even if it's known that deploying it entails risks, sooner or later someone will put it to use, as competition obliges. The aesthetic allostatic spiral that fuels an infinite thirst for knowledge is in this case supplanted by an equally infinite desire for practical development, industrial, commercial, whatever it is, overlooking the obvious fact that resources for their part are finite. Is this an attitude specific to the capitalistic logic alone? I could not say for sure. Though the respectful relationship with nature typical of pre-capitalist societies that could be observed would seem to suggest so. Whatever the case, what is certain is that as a social and economic system, capitalism selects and rewards in the individual, in each of us, those traits and tendencies, including fantasies, that confirm and consolidate the system's mode of operation. And in turn, this selection and reward consolidates the capitalist mentality in the individual, that is, in each and every one of us, whether or not we are aware of such process. one more allostatic spiral into which individual desires are drawn, making it difficult for the individual to oppose the system that unknowingly reinforces some of his least avowed aspirations. It follows, unsurprisingly, that we cannot rely on neutral technological solutions or on spontaneous individual initiatives to deal with the environmental and other crises that beset us. We cannot hope to see human beings engage in critical processes, either individually or collectively, without an awareness of the forces at work in the individual psyche, an understanding of how these forces are recruited by economic, social, and political dynamics, and how, in turn, they contribute to them. Capitalism exists only through infinitely increasing surpluses, wrote two French economists, Dostalaire and Maris, who drew considerably on Freud for their book Capitalisme et Pulsion de Mort, Capitalism and the Death Drive, which was published in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Of course, there are no perfect parallels between the economic and social realm on the one hand and the individual psyche on the other. We can nevertheless try to find real analogies, that is, not only resemblances, but actual operational analogies between them. And there is such an operative analogy between the allostasis at work in addiction and the allostasis of capitalist development. We can recognize this in a crisis that is tragically representative of both individual addiction and capitalist logic, and I'm naming the opioid crisis, which is claiming thousands of lives. It began in the US, but it's now in many countries. The relationship between capitalism and the opioid crisis is in fact twofold. First, because as recent trials in the United States have shown, it was directly provoked and sustained by an allostatic thirst for profit. Secondly, because the concept of allostasis, as I already mentioned, was formulated in the context of research into the brain mechanisms of addiction proper. As for psychoanalysts, allostasis was brought to my attention by the work of two French researchers, François Ansermet, an analyst, and Pierre Magistretti, a neuroscientist, both from Switzerland. On reflection, the dynamics of addiction embody the typical capitalist dream. The shorter the consumption cycle, the greater the need for products and the greater the profits. The relationship between capitalism and the death drive can be directly traced here. The excitation provided by the addictive substance exceeds the organism's capacity to cope with it. So when the substance finishes acting, the subject does not go back to equilibrium, but is left with a lack, a need greater than the previous one, so that the repetition of the same dose will not suffice, hence the ever stronger or more frequent doses, too often leading to a fatal overdose. The subject has thus moved from the impulsive consumption by which he started to compulsive consumption, and the substance is now used not for pleasure, but to silence the torment of withdrawal, a mechanism literally operating beyond the pleasure principle. Now, I hope to be clear in what follows, because I think I found a rule of 3. It is striking indeed at this point how the mechanics of addiction seem modeled on those of trauma as conceived by Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920. There, Freud described how an excitation in excess of the binding capacity of the psyche damages the psyche to varying degrees. And the damage then reveals, by triggering it, a mechanism operating beyond the pleasure principle, the compulsion to repeat. Thus begins the psychic system's fruitless struggle to regain the upper hand over the trauma in an attempt to bind the energy of the impact that has defeated it. A struggle which, given the repetition of failure, often ends in aggravation. So there goes again the allostatic spiral that ultimately leads to the exhaustion of the system. The death drive, thereupon introduced by Freud, is clearly at home here, replacing and upending the previous drive theory. But then, having recognized an allostatic process in the modalities of trauma and of addiction, a process, as we saw, itself analogous to the stimulus hunger that Freud described in the sexual drive, then here we have a rule of 3. The damage caused by the trauma, just as the one caused by addiction, becomes the internal source of an unbinding process, which is characteristic of the death drive. Moreover, its pressure on the system is constant, giving rise to the compulsion to repeat. But here is a trick. Remarkably, the traumatic breach, by installing an internal source which exerts constant pressure, satisfies the operational criteria by which Freud described not the death drive, but the sexual drive itself in 1915. So whereas Freud thought that the death drive was totally different from the other drives and had no energy of its own and introduced a new domain, we could say that this is not the case. The death drive, far from being so new and different, can, on the contrary, take its place among the typical drives described in the metapsychology of 1915, even possessing its own energy and functioning in the same way as the sexual drive. So you see, I am here getting closer to Laplanche's idea that the death drive in Freud is actually a sexual death drive, with death meaning essentially its unbinding nature, its unbinding effect. Now, you may remember that Freud also called the self-preservation drives ego drives. So the question is now, is the ego also homeostatic as the self-preservation drives? Through its basic inhibitory function, as described by Freud very early on, we would be led to believe so, that the ego is homeostatic. But the introduction of narcissism contradicts this conclusion. Though from a metapsychological point of view, narcissism means the libidinal investment of the self-image, in short, self-love, the static allure of this definition can be deceptive, masking the complex processes by which it is established. It is worth remembering that, conceived as the libidinal reserve of the ego, narcissism was also born of the relationship between the infant and its caretakers, starting with the familiar scene of parents enraptured at the sight of what Freud described as His Majesty the baby. Winnicott, for his part, described the child's necessary illusion of omnipotence while making it clear that it's not just an illusion. The care given to the baby's slightest need means that for a time, and I quote Winnicott here, omnipotence is almost a fact of experience, end of quote. Obviously, when all goes well, this fact of experience shall be relegated to the realm of myth by a gradual disillusionment that is just as necessary as the illusion itself, and a disillusionment which will give rise to a better access to reality. The child thus normally ends up renouncing its princely status. Its omnipotence becomes the object of a vague nostalgia, later detectable in dreams, reveries, fantasies, and other fictions. Except that, as Freud often pointed out, human beings find it very hard to give up what they once possessed, and the loss of omnipotence is one of the most painful things to give up. Ask to someone in Washington right now. Sometimes, therefore, gradual disillusionment does not go down well. As Winnicott again writes, I quote, "The mother's task is ultimately to gradually disillusion the infant, but she has no chance of succeeding if she has not first been able to create sufficient opportunities for illusion," end of quote. Consequently, if the child's care was such, and here let's not blame the mother alone, of course. If the child's care was such that the opportunities for illusion were too rare, the subject clings to omnipotence, denies its loss, and seeks to regain it. We might add, in the manner of an addiction. Any denial of the subject's importance will arouse even more strongly his need and illusion of grandeur, sometimes to the point of delusion. Such a relentless narcissistic quest shows that the ego itself can therefore be subject to allostatic processes, a far cry from the constancy principle. The desire, or rather this narcissistic need for omnipotence, experienced in the mode of addiction, combines with the sexual drive and the Bemächtigungstrieb as the third ingredient of what we shall call, from now on, a sexual drive for power. Let me be clear, however, that I am not introducing a new drive, believing instead that the word drive does not denote discrete entities. So new drive would have no meaning in my mind. Drive means the thrust of some psychic processes, or not so psychic processes for that matter. I therefore posit that under the effect of a thrust called the sexual drive for power, the subject is prey to a jouissance, to a passion, to a fever that is the common denominator for everything in the human psyche that contributes to our present social unease. In its extreme forms, a sexual drive for power manifests itself, for example, in the narcissistic triad described by Melanie Klein in the 40s in her study of manic depressive states. The triad is triumph, contempt, and omnipotent control. A triad that can also be found in many aspects of our current global crisis. To give just one example, consider the way Russian war propaganda portrayed Ukraine and its people shortly before the invasion. In the great Russian ideology, Ukrainians are just little Russians, contempt, who must humbly reintegrate the empire, control. And if they object, it means they are just Nazis, contempt. But in any case, in a few days or weeks, they shall be defeated, triumph. A sexual drive for power, it should be pointed out, is at work to varying degrees in each of us. It is, I believe, in this composite form that the sexual drive proves disturbing and conflictual and triggers, in varying degrees of success, secondary repression and suppression, as well as other mechanisms that will decide its fate. Taken in isolation, indeed, the sexual drive alone, the infantile sexual, is best described as desire or even love, which is the spice of life. So it's not a question of wanting to abolish the sexual drive. But when combined with the drive for power and the fantasy of omnipotence, that is, when forming what I call the sexual drive for power, it has nothing to do with love. Quite the contrary. It deals with part objects and not with full-fledged persons or subjects to whom their own desires would be acknowledged. The object of a sexual drive for power is no more than an instrument of unfettered enjoyment, which must bend to the allostatic need for ever more stimulus, a disposable object submitted to destructive control. Let me readily admit that faced with such a picture, we could speak like Laplanche of a sexual death drive, or like André Green of death narcissism. Alternatively, we could just as easily call it a sexual drive for omnipotence. As I said, I wouldn't battle for names because I'm not referring to entities. I am referring to the combined thrust of the sexual drive, of the drive for power, and of narcissistic omnipotence. Whatever the name, the point is that the sexual drive only becomes truly incompatible with the ego through its junction with drive for power and its recruitment by the narcissistic sense of omnipotence. Excuse me. In which case, sexual life is no longer playful, but corresponds to an imperative need similar to addiction. And we know that many of the sexual depravities do behave in the way of addiction. In Civilization and its Discontents, Freud proposed that belonging to culture imposes a painful renunciation regarding the drives. Renunciation is certainly not a total negation, however. It's not firmly opposed to desire, or in that case, the cultural process would be deprived of its engine. We might even think with Pasolini that the culture of a given epoch, like the epoch he was describing in the 1960s, demand, on the contrary, sexual pleasure, thus diverting it in another way. What culture demands more generally is to renounce the direct discharge of drive energy and to bring it instead to another level. This other level is what Valéry called the order of things of the spirit or mind, aesthetic things. In this order of facts, as a modality of the sexual, allostasis is always at work, continually renewing the aesthetic experience, operating, to use again Valéry's words, as the masterpiece of infinite sensitivity, which is to create the aesthetic need from its satisfaction, so that culture goes on, creativity goes on indefinitely. Culture, therefore, demands of us to renounce not the drive itself, but the type of relationship with the human other that the sexual drive for power aims for. A drive that is for its satisfaction, need to transform aesthetic things into finite, practical things, and infinite sensitivity into pure practical need, opening the way to addiction. So the question is not whether and how drives transform into culture, or there is probably no order of succession between the two. The human being is from the outset both a driven and a cultural subject. Rather, it is a matter of keeping in mind that since the allostatic dynamic, and we could speak of allodynamics for short, applies as much to the drives as to aesthetic sensibility, an important source of our current crisis is not, therefore, allostasis itself, but what one might call the allostatic alliance between the sexual drive for power and capitalistic logic, an alliance reducing the objects of culture to the finite practical things and infinite sensibility to a calculated pursuit of infinite gain and power. In a famous passage from Moses and Monotheism, Freud wrote, "We are living in a especially remarkable period. We find to our astonishment that progress has allied itself with barbarism." End of quote. I would venture to guess that this especially remarkable period coincides with the modern era from its very start, an era whose path to progress has officially been made in the name of mastering the forces of nature, but has in fact always been coupled with the violence of power and control over the other human being. We need only think of the role of slavery in the development of advanced capitalist societies, bearing in mind that despite the revolutions that have tried to abolish slavery over the past 3 centuries, not only slavery, but outrageous exploitation and oppression in all its forms are still with us and are even regaining ground. We could also say that the alliance between progress and barbarism is forged in each and every one of us when sexual desire is coupled with a narcissistic desire for total power over the other. If the sexual drive for power does indeed coincide with the dynamics of capitalism, my final question is therefore if and how, knowing this, can we contribute to the effort to contain the many contemporary crises? But here I must leave with the question. I would not dare claim the omnipotence of possessing the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scarfone, for this incredibly complex and thought-provoking paper. I'd like to invite everyone to ask questions or make comments and put it into the Q&A section. You can find that at the bottom of the screen. And then I can read it and hopefully we can have a discussion. And as long as we're waiting for others to participate, I'm going to share my own first reaction as I was reading this paper, which was a very pessimistic one. I originally am from Hungary, and the socialist system and its demise was definitely part of my life. And this paper specifically made me wonder whether like a more socialist communist economic system didn't survive precisely because it did not align with these, sexual drive for power in the individual, so that something was not working and it couldn't sustain the system itself. which then leaves us with this system that is aligned, which ultimately will, destroy all of us and the whole world, it looks like. So I don't know what would be an alternative, but it made me wonder if there is one really, or systems need to in some ways align with this very destructive drive to sustain itself. So that was my question.
Well, your remarks and your question are very important indeed. Yes, my paper has a pessimistic tone. I agree. However, I thought that if it has any sense, any value, which of course I leave to you to judge if it has, I think that the understanding of these dynamics, if they are valid to any extent, can possibly contribute, however slightly, to the dynamics of eros that Freud hoped for as a counterblast to the drive or the drive for destruction. And I believe that we have this in us as well. I haven't highlighted it as much as I wanted to try and show what I meant by the sexual drive for power. But I think that if we can work, and psychoanalysis is certainly a discipline that works in that direction, that is in favoring the emergence of the human subject by contrast of the quasi-human or non-human drive object, which is only an instrument, then we can possibly satisfy Kant's maxim, that is to treat the other human as an end and not as a means. And this, of course, requires giving priority to education, giving priority to the minimal conditions of existence that allow for well-being, and therefore for the capacity to love without fearing for the exertion of arbitrary power on us and so on. I don't know how we will be able to overcome the present situation. We are going in the wrong direction, obviously, but new generations are emerging which are insisting and calling on us to do something. And I must say, however derided she may be by some, I am a fan of Greta Thunberg, and I think that what she was able to do with the youth of the world is something that is encouraging. And I think that this is eros at work, not only eros, but also the drive for aggression combined with eros in the most positive sense. When she lectures us, the older generations, in the way she does, I think she's correctly aggressive and therefore in the long run in the service of eros. So I think there is still a chance that we find a solution to our problems, and I would certainly hope so. But I think that we have to be very aware of the dynamics that I'm talking of, because it's there under our eyes. What do we see in the world today? War, drug addiction, violence, femicide, and so on. So it's all there under our eyes, and these dynamics that I described, I think, are able of explicating what is going on in the individual mind and collectively as well.
Thank you. That was definitely a more hopeful framing. Here's another question and comment. from Aisha Abbasi. What a superb paper. So much to think about. I'm choosing only one question to ask. Could you say more about the breach in trauma, its similarity to what happens in addiction, and their link to the sexual death drive? I'm trying to wrap my mind around this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Aisha. Thank you for asking this. It's at the center of the paper indeed, because we have the sexual drive, which, as I mentioned, Freud himself, but Freud never elaborated on this. I must be honest with you. This is not a central Freudian tenet, this incapacity for the drive to get full satisfaction, which is therefore creates this Reizhunger, this hunger for stimulation, which he describes. He never comes back to that really in later. However, we have the right to take it up and make our own use of it. And so we have this on one hand. So the sexual drive, strictly speaking, the sexual drive, not love, but the sexual drive, is already inscribed into the dynamics of allostasis. That is, the more you get, the more you want. Addiction behaves like trauma because it breaks the capacity for an equilibrium obtained through feedback. Addiction does not, what the addiction shows is that the feedback loop is broken, and instead we have a feed-forward loop, which means the creation of a spiral, because, as I said, the intensity of the experience of the drug use is such that it breaks the homeostatic capacity of the brain. It breaks what the neurophysiologists call the reward system in the brain. And therefore, it leaves a gap, it leaves a lack behind, so that when the effect of the substance vanishes, the subject is left with a need for a greater dose of that substance in order to achieve something that will never be like the first buzz, the first experience. And so we have, again, the allostatic loop of needing always more. Now, trauma, Freud describes it in 1920 as an excess of stimulation that paralyzes the functions, the defensive functions of the psyche. And this breach in the psyche makes it so that it cannot bind the energy, the impact of the traumatic event. In response to which the repetition compulsion is triggered as an effort to regain control, to bind finally that energy. But the repetition compulsion will fail in doing so. And this is why it's repetition. It's because the trying to get the upper hand again will fail. And therefore, we have to try again, fail again, try again. So here we have the three components behaving in the same way. I added another component, which is the narcissistic quest for omnipotence, which also behaves in the same way, because omnipotence cannot be gained in reality. Therefore, the quest for omnipotence is bound to fail, and therefore to trigger new attempts at control and omnipotence. And unfortunately, we do not need to look very far to see that at work in our present society. And so this central mechanism, allostatic mechanism, is to me a very useful way of bringing together the many aspects of the human complexity, which works in the sense of creating the craving for always more, which, as it happens, is totally compatible and even prized, I would say, by the capitalistic logic. Grow, always grow, or you'll disappear. If you don't get bigger, you will get smaller and finally die as an enterprise, as a company, as a financial enterprise, and so on. So that we have the conjunction of the individual dynamics and of the dynamics of economy and politics, because it's the same thing with power. When you have power, you want to stay in power. And I think it's Henry Kissinger who used to say that power is the best aphrodisiac. So he made the conjunction between power and sexuality. And I think it's very clear, very easy to see that whenever people have power, they have a great problem leaving power, great difficulty in leaving power. There's a guy somewhere near you who is looking for a third term. He wouldn't let go of his position of power. And I think that this is him, but it's in the script of every power dynamics, except that there are people who can at some point accept to leave the room for someone else to replace them. And this is how democracy works. So, but we know how democracy is, for the time being, in jeopardy. We have people in many countries who have such a problem with the idea of leaving power that they prefer unending wars. Russia, and unfortunately, presently also Israel, etc., etc. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Mr. Forrest, who also says, thank you for this lucid and illuminating talk. Does Dr. Scarfone have any opinion on Freud's use of the word demonic in relation to the sexual drive?
Actually, yes. Well, it's not my idea, it's Laplanche's idea, but Laplanche, who was always critical of the often naive use that was done of the notion of death drive, naive or too simplistic, because for him, Freud being Freud, after he introduced narcissism, he had a period where, for him, the main conflict was the conflict between object libido and ego libido. That is, that the libido being in a kind of zero-sum situation, the libido that was invested in the object had to be borrowed from the ego, and therefore the object had to love us back to give back the libido. So this was a question of a very tame idea of the sexual drive. The sexual drive, which he, before introducing narcissism, always was called by Freud demonic, as you have noticed. It wasn't so demonic after all, after the introduction of narcissism. We had just a kind of civilized exchange of quantities of libido. Then Laplanche says, Freud being Freud, he could not stay with that very civilized state of affairs. He had to find back the demonic. And this is when he was forced by, perhaps unknowingly, to introduce a new form of demonic force, which he called the dead drive. So for Laplanche, the dead drive is not a discovery, it's a rediscovery under another name of the demonic sexual drive. Demonic meaning what? Meaning the unbinding effect of the sexual drive. This love is bound. Love is libido that is bound to the ego and to the object, and which binds the ego and the object together. The drive, as we know, does not care for the object. It uses the object in the search of satisfaction, and can dispose of the object accordingly whenever it doesn't need it anymore. So the drive is unbinding, the sexual drive. Whereas the self-preservative drives, they are not unbinding. They are in the service of life, in the service of survival. And the attachment is a very good example of a self-preservative drive at work in both mother and child, so that we have a very positive spiral of relationships. So we are on the side of binding. But the sexual drive is always disruptive because of its unbinding nature. And why is it unbinding? Here, we would have to open a new chapter. Freud would say it's unbinding by nature. Laplanche says it's because when the child first encounters the sexual, it comes from the adults in the form of something that the child cannot possibly understand, cannot possibly integrate and master, and cannot possibly make sense of or translate. And therefore, his failure of translation leaves what Freud called fueros in his letter to Fliess, which was called Letter 52. And Laplanche calls these the sources of the drives. That is, these residual, untranslated bits of communication that are not communicating anything anymore because they are meaningless, but the child cannot do away with them. They are inscribed in its experience, in its mind over the time, and they stay as this continuous source of internal stimulation, which we call a drive. And it's disruptive because it's meaningless. And as we know, the mind has an imperative urge to make meaning, to create meaning. Its survival is at stake. So here we have the demonic as unbinding, unbound energy and unbinding energy, which was rediscovered by Freud under the name of this death drive, which had little to do with death, actually, in the biological sense, but everything to do with the unbinding of psychic structures and therefore with disturbance in the mind.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Cecilia Wu, who asks you to say a little bit more about the inadequacy of reality testing and what the alternative may be.
A very good question indeed. Well, it's not the inadequacy. I think we have a reality testing somewhere. The problem is how Freud explains the reality testing, because when he tries to explain it, well, he puts the rabbit into the hat before pulling it out again. He says that we have a way of comparing what was just an imagination with what is actually perceived out there. The problem is that if we can compare it, then it means that we already know what is truly real out there. Therefore, we have the reality testing. So my mentioning of the problem is that Freud's explanation does not explain anything. It begs the question. However, I think we have access to reality, and this was actually Freud's original idea before the 1900s, he thought that perception had a direct access to reality. The only problem we have is that our memory traces can be activated so intensely that they give the appearance of reality, and that we can be illusioned by our desires. Therefore, it's our memory that plays tricks on us in our relationship to reality. But we have many strategies by which we can test reality, and I think that essentially we do something similar to excuse me, to the scientific experiment. We test not by comparing our imagination with our perception, because we can be misled by our perception, but by doing a third thing, which is inserting, for instance, a variable into the situation and see what happens, so that we know that we are playing with reality. But this would be a long digression, I'm afraid, if we want to go into more detail about this.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Michelle Stevens, who says, thank you for this stimulating presentation and for making the links to our moment so clear. I appreciated your reminder that the homeostasis depends on equilibrium through feedback. Do you think this feedback could also come through the relational regulation of the analytic process that the analytic process provides? Is that partly how Eros could push back on, contain, regulate this repetitive drive for omnipotence? Socially and politically even, could the imperative to provide feedback as a form of regulation of the allostatic describe something about the importance of the democratic process?
Oh, yeah. Wow. Well, I would give a general yes response to everything you say. But I like the idea of reinserting feedback in the analytic process, because I believe that, for instance, transference starts by being allostatic. It's not a feedback loop. And it will look for always more. And we know we have instances of transference that can get really, really intense and really problematic. And we have to stay there, to stay the course, in spite of the violent manifestation of transference sometimes. So that in that sense, yes, we are ending up with the capacity to represent a certain feedback loop rather than this spiral of ever-growing intensity. And I think that this is what Winnicott meant by survival when he said that it's the task of the object to survive the destruction, which was not a real destruction to begin with, but the destructive intent, let's say, of the child. The parent must survive. And what is to survive? It's not to retaliate. That is not to feed the allostatic loop, because if you retaliate, you create new incentive for aggression and so on. So I think that you're right. I hadn't thought of that in those terms, but I would be tempted to say you're right, that in the end, we are reestablishing a certain feedback, although probably not a perfect feedback loop, because one day our patient has to muster the courage to leave us. If we had a perfect feedback loop, why would they leave? They would be so totally at ease with us. And so I think that at some point there is some discrepancy between the expectations and the response that we can give. But fortunately, instead of re-embarking in the ever more logic, they will look elsewhere. They will discover that there are other places where they can find the object of their desire. So I think it's, yes, a sort of feedback, not a perfect one. Off the top of my head, just right now, I never thought of that before in those terms.
Thank you. The next question is from Cornelius Duffalo, who says, thank you for this fascinating talk. Before tonight, if I had heard you describe the sexual drive for power, I might have placed it in the category of perversion. I noticed that you do not talk about perversion. Is this because you're describing the source of the drive rather than the object?
This is a very good question as well. I could have mentioned perversion indeed. I mentioned it indirectly when I spoke of the difference between love and the sexual drive and why the sexual drive is disruptive. I could have said, as I think, as I do in my conversation with Avgi Saketopoulou in my latest book, which was mentioned earlier, that if we read Freud closely in the 3 essays, he himself suggests that human sexuality is perverse from the outset. However, I think that we have to make a distinction, and perhaps we could use 2 words, perversion as a generic term for the deviance, the inherent deviance of human sexuality compared to animal sexuality, for instance. As I said, animal sexuality is homeostatic in the sense it's regulated by biological clocks, and it's very, very well framed into a biological set. Human sexuality is not, and especially when looked at from the psychoanalytic point of view, it could be called perverse. You know, you all know the famous quote by Freud, where the child becomes polymorphously perverse under the effect of seduction. Now, if we agree with Laplanche that seduction happens all the time, well, you have all the time perverse sexuality as the basic human sexuality. However, I would distinguish perverse in that sense from the perversity, from the pathological perversity where another human is used not playfully, but violently as a mere instrument of satisfaction, of sexual enjoyment, and canceling the status of subject in this other human. Then I would perhaps, to make sure that we do not confuse the 2 levels, I would call that the perversity rather than the perversion. But yes, I would agree with you that the sexual drive for power is perverse, but perhaps more than perverse, it's perverse in the sense of perversity and of abuse.
Thank you. I think that, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just wanted
Yes.
but it can be tamed, it can be contained by the capacity to establish a love relationship, of course.
I think the last question I will ask you is basically an elaboration on a previous, or my comment really. And it reads that, thank you so much for this wonderful paper. This is from someone anonymous. In the United States, there is currently a broad attempt to destroy knowledge, research, and science, and to extend the destruction and domination of nature through privatization of public lands, drilling, mining, and so on. Do you think it is possible for humans to reverse course and value knowledge again in place of the material possessions, or will human drive for omnipotence destroy us all?
Well, as I said earlier, I am no prophet, so I tend to be somewhat optimistic, not fully optimistic, but somewhat optimistic in the sense that we went through crises such as this one. We, the humankind, let's think of the Nazi era, the era of fascism in Italy, in Germany, in Japan, and so on. And somehow, not without bruises, but we came out of it and democracy could prevail again. Democracy was flourishing some 15 or 20 years ago. We were very hopeful that democracy would flourish in many more countries than it is present now. We are now in a kind of low. I can imagine that, and here let me be possibly intrusive into American politics. I'm not American, I'm Canadian and Italian. I was born in Italy, which which has its own problems right now. But I look at what happens in the US right now in these few weeks since you have a new president. And I cannot imagine that the American people will remain quiet after a certain time of so much abuse of power, of so much folly, indeed, if I may say. I hope I'm not hurting anyone by saying this, but I really believe that the American people will have the energy and the will to bring back reason at the top of their government, and to bring back equity, to bring back science, because it's in their vital interest. This is a very negative spiral that we are observing right now, and I cannot imagine that anyone, or well, I can imagine quite a few that will be satisfied with that, but I cannot imagine that the majority will tolerate for a long time. You have a certain saying, you can fool some of the people most of the time, but not most of the people most of the time. So I am confident in the American people because you have often shown the way, and especially you have been the longest democracy in the history of the world. So I cannot imagine that the American people will let it go that easily, although presently there are signs to the contrary, but I'm really hopeful in that sense. But I could not swear that this will turn out to be the case. I just hope, as I guess many of you, if not all, do.
Thank you so much. The last thing I will say is that there are a few requests for the paper, including references. I don't know if it's possible to provide that in some form.
Well, the paper was published in French. I read the English version that I made myself, and so please forgive the eventual harm to the English language. I hope to publish it, so I'm afraid I cannot circulate it widely because I don't know. I'll have to think about it. Perhaps we can discuss it with Stefan and Orshi later this week or next week and see what can be done.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Scarfone and Dr. Inani. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation and moderation. In terms of the paper, I think we can talk about making it available, publishing it, and everyone who's interested, they can reach out to me directly if you have my email, and we'll try to see what's possible to make this available. we reached the end of our evening together on a definitely more hopeful note. And I wish everybody a good rest of your night and or day, wherever you are, and a good weekend. Thank you again to the presenter and the moderator.
Thank you. Thank you.